Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's been really wonderful listening to everyone's presentations so far. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you about our research that investigated the association between late preterm birth and cardiometabolic conditions across the life course. So to begin, I'll start with some background information. So global estimates have indicated that the rate of preterm birth is 10.6%, meaning that about 14.9 million children annually are born preterm. However, late preterm infants, who are those generally born between 34 and 36 weeks of gestation, are currently the largest growing subset of preterm neonates, accounting for 75% of all preterm births. So despite the increasing number of late preterm births, previous research has largely focused on very preterm births, which is birth before 32 weeks, or any preterm birth, which is any birth before 37 weeks of gestation. Previous research on very preterm and any preterm infants has shown a higher risk for chronic conditions in adulthood, such as cardiovascular disease or diabetes. However, the long-term cardiometabolic outcomes of late preterm infants remains unclear. So there have been some studies that found evidence that late preterm infants may be at a greater risk for adverse health consequences. And so our review aimed to address this knowledge gap pertaining to the association between late preterm birth and cardiometabolic conditions, hypothesizing that it would be associated with an increased risk across the life course. So we conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis to investigate if being born late preterm compared to term, which is birth between 37 and 42 weeks of gestation, is a risk factor for increased cardiometabolic outcomes in children and adults. We conducted a systematic search in 3 electronic databases, including Embase, Medline, and CINAHL in June of 2020. And these captured 2 main concepts of late preterm birth and cardiometabolic risk. 2 independent reviewers screened the studies at the title, abstract, and full text level and extracted the appropriate data. And 2 independent reviewers also assessed possible risk of bias, doing so using the Newcastle-Ottawa scale. In the case of any conflicts for selection, extraction, or risk of bias, a 3rd reviewer determined consensus. So based on the data we extracted, we were able to conduct 4 meta-analyses, and these analyzed hypertension, BMI, diabetes, and ischemic heart disease, with subgroups divided into children and adults for all of those outcomes except ischemic heart disease. The data was analyzed using Revman, and to obtain summary estimates, we pooled individual study results using the generic inverse variance method with random effects models. Finally, the certainty of the evidence from the meta-analysis was evaluated using grade, and for outcomes not included in the meta-analysis, we narratively synthesized these outcomes. So together, our searches in Medline, Embase, and CINAHL resulted in just over 12,000 studies being screened at the title abstract level. Following this, 277 studies were screened at full text, of which 34 were included. We also hand searched reference lists of included studies to identify any missing ones. Studies were included that were conducted in human participants, written in English, and published in any year. And we also excluded studies based on criteria such as if they evaluated outcomes in the first year of life only, if they assessed maternal outcomes only, or included only infants with congenital anomalies or pre-existing cardiometabolic disease. So all 34 studies included were cohort studies and were published between the years of 2000 and 2020. Most of these studies were conducted in Scandinavian countries. The included studies examined several cardiometabolic outcomes. These included hypertension, BMI, diabetes, and ischemic heart disease, which are included in the meta-analyses. And as well, 14 studies also looked at other cardiometabolic outcomes, which included heart failure, venous thromboembolism, blood lipids, and right ventricular mass. Late preterm birth was defined slightly differently between some studies. Most defined it as birth between 32 and 34 weeks, while some others also included moderately preterm birth, which means they also included 32 to 34 weeks. Using the Newcastle-Ottawa risk of bias tool, we assessed each study based on cohort selection, comparability, and the ascertainment of the outcome. And using this tool, studies can gain a score that ranges from 0 to 9. So the studies included in our review ranged from 4 to 9 stars with a median of 7. And the common risks for bias were due to follow-up duration or a lack of control for confounders, with 5 studies not controlling for any confounders. So to begin with the results, the association between late preterm birth compared to term and diabetes in children and adults can be seen here. Above, there were 4 studies that looked at type 1 diabetes in children. And together, this meta-analysis demonstrated an increased risk of diabetes, suggesting children have a 24% increased risk of diabetes following late preterm birth compared to term. In the subgroup with adults, the association was insignificant, and there was no evidence of subgroup differences between children and adults. For our study, we determined substantial heterogeneity to be identified by an I-squared value between 50 and 90%. So there was substantial heterogeneity among these studies, both in the adults and overall. So overall, these studies indicated there was a significant association between late preterm birth and any diabetes. And the certainty of this evidence using grade was determined to be low, as observational studies start in grade as low, and we did not downgrade these results. The results here demonstrate the association between hypertension between children born late preterm compared to term. In the subgroup analysis, this time there was a significant effect among adults, such that adults born late preterm had a 21% increased risk of hypertension compared to those born at term. The association among children was not significant, and here there was also no evidence of subgroup differences between children and adults. Overall, there was a significant increased risk of hypertension associated with late preterm birth compared to term in children and adults, and there was moderate heterogeneity. And then finally, these results were also not downgraded according to grade, so they were also low certainty. The results on this slide present the risk of ischemic heart disease above and body mass index below in individuals born late preterm compared to term. The effects for ischemic heart disease were observed in both children and adults. So these studies included individuals over 15 years of age, and the effects for BMI are just in children. So for ischemic heart disease, there was an increased risk, but this association was not significant. However, interestingly, for these studies, the ones that found a decreased risk were among older adults who were born before 1950, while the studies that found an increased risk were among younger adults born after 1970. For BMI, late preterm birth was associated with a reduced BMI Z score in children. However, this was not significant. Substantial heterogeneity was observed in the analysis for ischemic heart disease, and considerable heterogeneity for BMI, given in this case it was over 90%. The certainty for these results were both very low. The certainty for ischemic heart disease was downgraded due to inconsistency and imprecision, and for BMI was downgraded due to inconsistency. So there were several other studies that we narratively synthesized because there was an insufficient number for meta-analysis. Overall, the studies in children demonstrated an increased risk of high blood pressure, as well as triglycerides and insulin levels in boys, but there was no association with other metabolic markers such as cholesterol. In adults, late preterm birth was associated with metabolic syndrome and its components, as well as heart failure and venous thromboembolism. There were also some studies that looked at other outcomes like cerebrovascular disease and stroke, but they found no significant association. So overall, our meta-analysis provided low certainty of evidence that being born late preterm is associated with an increased risk of diabetes and hypertension in children and adults. While no association was observed for ischemic heart disease, an interesting trend was observed among younger and older adults. And additionally, for BMI, no association was observed, but we were not able to examine this association among adults. Our narrative synthesis described possible associations between late preterm birth and other cardiometabolic outcomes, such as blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. So overall, these findings are consistent with proposed biological mechanisms. It has been proposed that preterm birth may interrupt processes like nephrogenesis and kidney maturation, which could explain an increased risk for things like hypertension, as well. Mechanisms like a catch-up growth period following preterm birth may lead to physiological changes that can count for an increased risk of cardiometabolic outcomes. There were notable strengths and limitations to this study. In terms of strengths, we developed a very comprehensive search strategy that encompassed a broad range of cardiometabolic outcomes. We also performed a quantitative meta-analysis that combined results from several studies to improve the power of the findings. There were some limitations. Notably, of the 34 included studies, 23 were from Scandinavian countries and others from middle or high income countries, which limited the generalizability of the findings. Variability in confounders controlled for was also a limitation, with residual confounding being possible due to the observational designs. And then finally, there was substantial heterogeneity among the meta-analyses. So overall, the findings suggest that late preterm birth is associated with cardiometabolic outcomes in childhood and adulthood, and more research is needed to understand the mechanisms. However, these findings do provide support for future guidelines and targeted screening to improve cardiometabolic health in children and adults. So thank you so much for having me, and I welcome any questions now, or if you think of any later, please feel free to reach me by email.